Hello, everyone watching. I am Jonte Johns, your class president, and today I have the honor of having an interview with Dr. Brittany Mosby. Sorry. Um, how are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, Jonte. How are you?
Doing pretty good. So, for the
Excellent.
ones who do not know you at home or watching this all over, kind of introduce yourself and your role and what school you graduated from, and like, what is your job title?
Excellent. Yes. I serve as the director of Tennessee's statewide HBCU initiative currently. I work for the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, which is a state agency that is responsible for all of the higher education policy. So we mostly deal with public institutions like TSU. Um, Prior to becoming the director, I was actually a professor. I taught statistics, and that's my background. So I graduated from Spelman College, where I was a math major and went on to get degrees in math from Carnegie Mellon University, which is in Pittsburgh. And then I came back home and taught math and was teaching when I decided to go back to school to get my doctorate. And it was while I was working on my doctorate that I heard about this position and applied for it and got it. I have a strong background with HBCUs. My grandparents met at Spelman and Morehouse, so they were the cute Spelman Morehouse
Love
couple.
story.
Yes, yes, yes. I did not find my Morehouse mister, but that's okay. Life goes on. My love for HBCUs, nevertheless, as to say, my baby sister just graduated from Howard, up in DC, and we forgive her for that too, right? She picked the
Right,
wrong school, but
right,
that's
wrong
okay.
school.
Kept it in the family. Yes, my job is to basically ensure that HBCUs in Tennessee, we have seven. So TSU'S are public HBCU. There are six other private HBCUs across the state. And my job is to make sure that they're represented in state conversations when we talk about, how policy is going to affect different types of institutions, making sure that HBCUs are also considered. So in addition to, we think about community colleges, we think about the technical colleges that are in Tennessee. There's a distinction between public and private colleges. And so now we're just making sure that HBCUs are also, a special institution that are considered when it comes to everything from financial aid to state funding to college access and college going. THEC is responsible for pretty much anything you can think of when it comes to college going. We touch a little bit of everything in that higher ed space. And it's my role to make sure that HBCUs are represented around that space.
What would you say like your biggest challenge, like playing in the space where you have to be the one to speak up when something's going wrong with the HBCU or something that could affect a
Yes,
HBCU?
yes. The biggest challenge is that still in 2025, I'm having to educate people on what an HBCU is and
Mhm.
why it's important. So I know you probably have a story similar to mine. I chose my HBCU because I knew that I would fit in. I knew that I could discover who I was. I went to a predominantly white high school
Same.
in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And so I really looked forward to going to an HBCU as an opportunity to learn more about myself and to do it in an environment where I felt like I belonged. And so that's still true, probably for you. I'm sure that even today in 2025, students are making decisions about where to go to college based on that sense of belonging. And so it's a challenge that I still have to explain to people that HBCUs are relevant and they're worth, protecting and they're worth investment from the state, and that if every HBCU were to close, we would have students that would not go to school. So it's not like if HBCUs close, those students would just go to other schools. if HBCUs were to close across the state, that is an entire generation of students that just would not have college. And so that's part of the story that I have to tell. There are people like me who chose their HBCU because of family history. There are people who chose their HBCU, the AOB just won a Grammy. There are different reasons why you might choose your HBCU, but the point is that they're still relevant and they're still needed. And so that's one of the biggest barriers is an education barrier. Once you're able to explain, and this is why I love talking to students too, because I'm able to add to my collection of stories because it's those stories that help people understand those personal stories that help people understand why TSU is so vital in Nashville. Lane College is so vital in Jackson.
Mhm.
Lemoyne-Owen is vital in Memphis. Memphis, one of the, by proportions, one of the blackest cities in the state, has one HBCU, and that's Lemoyne-Owen. And so that's very important for those students there. So yeah, it's a challenge, but it's also luckily one that we can tackle with education. So just by telling stories and also telling the data. So the other side, there's two types of information, right? So there's qualitative data. Those are the stories, those are the anecdotes. But then there's quantitative data. So numerically, I taught math, I taught statistics. So I'm also all about showing those data stories. So the other side of the piece is that if you have two Black students, one who chooses, say, to go to MTSU and one who chooses to go to TSU, data shows us that time and time again, the student who goes to TSU is more likely to graduate simply because it is an HBCU. Not saying that MTSU is not a great school, it is, but for Black students, there's something that we can actually measure that increases when you go to an HBCU versus not going to an HBCU. So finding those kinds of data percentages is also a big part of my job. So it's great to tell the stories that feel good, but also to show the numbers, right? That choosing an HBCU makes a difference not only in academic outcomes, but after you graduate, HBCU students are more likely to be civically engaged. HBCU students are more likely to be registered to vote, and they vote. They're more likely to say that they have satisfaction in their life 10 years after graduation compared to students who didn't go to an HBCU. So there's a lot to talk about. And fortunately for me, a lot of it is good news. But yeah, that's my job in a nutshell.
Yeah, I see that happen a lot as well. It's like a lot of people, a lot of African Americans, once they graduate from PWI, they'll be like, man, I wish I went to
Yes,
HBCU. So that's just really cool to hear like the statistics of it all.
yes.
Basically, this interview today, guys, is about informing the student body of where Tennessee State stands, of course, with the state. So having someone here who's in the rooms and are hearing these conversations, to me, is very important as a student myself to understand what's going on. So we're gonna dive right into these questions. You ready?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Perfect. So the first question I will ask you is, how does the state justify the recent decisions regarding TSU's funding?
Yes. Okay. So let's backtrack a couple of steps. So I know our audience today, mostly freshmen, so I'm going to start. We're going to go back 4 years,
Hmm.
a little bit, but the story actually starts even before that. But we'll start with 4 years ago because that's what got us into the most dire situations today. 4 years ago, TSU had, is it 4 years? So forgive me if I get the years mixed up. It might be 3 years. Okay, 3 years ago, TSU had one of its largest incoming freshman classes, right? And
I think it was 3 years ago.
it was three. Okay, sorry. I get, man, time flies when you're having fun. Okay, so one of the largest freshman classes in history, which was great in terms of marketing and getting students into school. But and this is going to be a recurring theme. You can't just open the doors and let students in. It takes a lot to run a university. And the problems that we're seeing today, I want to emphasize are problems of operations and running the university, not of academics. Academics are great, strong, academic affairs, wonderful, and not problems of what we say are the student facing pieces. So, one of the things I've been able to observe over the years is that TSU again gets that student piece right. And the students that are graduating from TSU are still graduating and getting great jobs. And there are people at TSU who are still making sure that happens. The issues with TSU today are mostly operational and financial issues. So let's get into it. When they had the largest incoming class ever, that was great, but the university wasn't ready for them. So, what are some of the costs associated with having students on campus? Security, housing, food. So, in addition to having the largest class in history, they also had the largest spending in history. So, they had to double and triple the security. Students who were staying in hotels, they had to get back and forth. So there were buses, right, going back and
Mm.
forth to campus. And so that year, expenses shot up almost to the point where the university couldn't keep up. And that's where we are today. So unfortunately, with that huge class, there was also a financial setback. And that's what TSU is trying to recover from today. The other thing to keep in mind, TSU is a school that was founded on and still remains committed to access and to providing access to students and making a college education affordable, right?
Right.
But let's say it costs $1 to take a class, okay? Because I'm committed to making access for you, I'm going to only charge you 50 cents. And I'll say I'll give you a 50-cent scholarship. That's great, right? But it still costs $1 because I got to pay the faculty, I got to pay, everyone else. And so what happened at TSU that year is they were only charging 50 cents, but it still cost $1. Faculty had to be paid, and the grass had to be cut.
Right.
Dorms had to be cleaned. You still had to pay janitorial staff, and so what we're seeing, unfortunately, is just a financial crunch that happened because of short-sighted planning. So at the time, a combination of funding from the pandemic era and just that HBCU renaissance. So this was 2021 when right after, coming out of the pandemic, everyone was really excited about HBCUs. Following George Floyd, we just saw an influx, which was great. Unfortunately, there were a lot of other moving pieces that kind of led to where we are today. So what's happening today? So today, and unique to TSU. So other schools also saw, enrollment jumps and changes in and expenditures. But because TSU is so focused on affordability, they didn't have the same cushion that other schools had, right? So a school like UT Knoxville, for example, has a bit more of a operational cushion for a variety of reasons. Over time, racism, differences in land grant funding, differences in alumni giving back. There are a lot of reasons why the institutions have different financial pictures. However, at the end of the day, TSU didn't have the same cushion to make those decisions. And so right now, the current president, Mr. Tucker, and the administration are looking at how do we rebuild from that particular set of circumstances that led us to here. So when we talk about things about we don't have money, or we're running out of money, or there's not enough to make it until May or 2030 or what have you, it's because the university had to invest a lot of its cushion money into that huge incoming class that particular year.
Mm.
So that's part one. The other part of the story goes back even further, and that is back in the early 2010s or so, the state of Tennessee changed the way it funds all of its public institutions. Okay, so this is everybody from UT, Martin, all the way down to Southwest Community College in Memphis. Um, Now you get your state appropriations based on what we call outcomes. So in higher ed, we are interested in how many students came back after their freshman year, how many students came back after their sophomore year, how many came back after their junior year, and then how many students graduated. Okay. So that means we're counting the number of credit hours each university accumulates. So um, that's one of the pieces of the funding formula. So one of the ways that TSU was harmed is that when students drop out, when students don't get passing grades, when students have to go to academic probation, um, TSU that next year doesn't get funding for those students, right? Because the university is held accountable. So essentially, the funding is like a contract between the state and the school. Once you admit these students, we will continue to give you funding based on their progression. Okay.
Mhm.
So um, when that funding formula took place, universities were allowed to kind of pick and choose what weights they wanted to put the most importance on. Okay. So um, the state said, and I'm a math teacher, so this is going to get very mathy. I'm sorry.
Right.
Okay, but you got an equation, and the state said these are your variables. Okay, X, Y, Z. This is what we're going to measure. And then universities were allowed to say, okay, I want three of X, one of Y, one of Z. Okay, so X is student progression, like we talked about. Y is research. So how much research the faculty are doing. And Z is other stuff that doesn't really matter to us for this conversation. Okay. Um, TSU, you may have heard, TSU has been um, pursuing R1 status, Research 1 status, which is the highest classification of a university according to the Carnegie classification of universities. So at the time, TSU put all of their funding weight on research and not necessarily on student completion. So what you have is just kind of, as you can see, it's very complicated. There were a lot of things that kind of went into how we got here today. And so for that reason, it's no one person's fault or one department's fault, but just kind of a combination of things. So we got the funding formula that changed. The university decided to focus on research at the time. And then we had this influx of students that needed services that we weren't able to afford. Okay. If we go back even further to 1890, okay, let's talk about the land grant funding and the 2.1 billion.
Mm.
Okay. So that's the final piece of the puzzle that we are looking to understand and looking to solve. So for this point, I would say I would encourage students to always be wary of your sources. So at this point, I have seen at least 5 different stories on how we came to be owed 2.1 billion and whether or not we're going to get it. So this is how I understand it. Okay. And I encourage you to question me just like you question every story. But here's what happened. So back in 1890, this was after the Civil War, the federal government said for Southern states, if you are not allowing Black students to come to your white schools, then you have to open one for Black students. Okay. And so by 1912 in Tennessee, that was TSU. Okay. So beginning with the formation of those 1890 land grant institutions, the federal government started sending money down to the states and said, give this to your land grant schools. Okay. But what the federal government did not do is say, give this equally to your land grant schools. So the feds never required, because, and remember, this is during Reconstruction, Dixiecrat Democrats. So the federal government at the time knew they couldn't make the South do something they didn't want to do. So that's why it was never included in the law. All right. So fast forward to today. If you compare over time how much University of Tennessee got compared to how much TSU got, there is a difference. And the difference has gotten bigger over time. If you're wondering why hasn't the state paid, it's because the question is, what does the state owe? If there was never a law that said it had to be equal, then how do we really decide what's fair? And that's where we are today, is figuring out what's fair, what makes sense. And to be honest, the Republicans of today are saying, well, that was their problem back then. Why are you calling us racist today for racism from the past? And so you can understand the political conversations are very difficult. So what we've got is a philosophical question. What is owed to TSU? So back in, and we'll have to check the years because I'm not good at years, but back in, I believe 2022. Nope, this was also 2021. So before that incoming class. So this was 4 years ago. Um, the governor included in his budget a one-time payout of $250 million to TSU because even he saw that, yeah, there's a big difference between how much we give to TSU and how much we give to UT.
Mhm.
And so that was like a first step towards figuring out what's fair. Okay, 250 million, no questions asked for infrastructure for TSU. So that particular pot of money is also how TSU is kind of staying afloat right now as we're figuring out, how do we make up for that large freshman class and that spending. So there's that 250. Um, but the bigger question is, okay, how far back do we go before we start tallying? So that 2.1 billion, it was the US Department of Education that came up with that number. And what they did was they went back as far as they could, which was about the 1950s, and they compared on a per student basis.
Mhm.
So, from a data perspective, that's a little iffy because enrollments aren't the same. Enrollments change and for a variety of reasons. So, this is, I know your question, so I'm going to get a little bit ahead of you. One piece of legislation to be on the lookout for this year, Representative Harold Love in the House and Senator Ackberry in the Senate are sponsoring a bill that asks THEC to calculate the number specifically for the state of Tennessee.
Mhm.
So, can we get a better handle on what what that difference is? And again, there's no law that said ever it had to be. That's not true. In 2002 is when Congress passed a law that said it has to be 100% and 100%. Only 2002, right?
So was the, not to cut you off.
No, no,
So
please do. Yeah.
after 2002,
Mhm.
was TSU still not getting the equal share of money?
Yes. So starting in 2002, so the way the federal government works is they always give you a heads up. So in 2002, they said by 2007, you've got to have a 100% match. So technically, starting from 2007, TSU has been getting its 100% match on its land grant funding. The other important thing to point out here is that we're specifically talking about funding for ag programs. This
Mm.
is separate from funding for the schools, separate from the state appropriations. And when we talk about land grant funding, we're talking about things that would go towards the extension and research, those 1890 scholarships, the agribusiness development programs, and things like that. So that's the other piece. It's kind of hard to untangle is, once we figure out what's fair, do we just give all that money to the ag department,
Mm.
knowing that there are other issues on campus that need to be solved? And is it really fair to give a lump sum to ag? So there's a lot to untangle and to think about. And honestly, there's no easy answers. So part of my job is just to listen and to make sure that we're considering all of the complex aspects. And so there's legal considerations, and then there's considerations currently for students. So Back when I first started this job in 2018, I think that next year the heat went out at TSU. So at that point, it's like, forget agriculture. We need the students, to have heat,
Right.
water. We need what's called deferred maintenance on the dorms, right? So it's there's a lot happening. There's a lot happening, and whew, um, it's a problem that fortunately President Tucker is really working diligently on, and then THEC as well. So THEC as a state agency, it's important for us to make sure that the only public HBCU in Nashville, one of the fastest growing cities in the country, because that's one of the selling points when businesses come to Nashville. What kind of university situation you got here? And we can't let Vanderbilt get all the business, right? We need to make sure that our public institution is ready as well. So that's a very long answer to that question right there. I'll stop.
No, no, that's all good. It kind of leads into my next question, is what are the concerns the state has about TSU's financial management?
Yes.
So I know what we're reading in the media is like, okay, even if we give you this money, what are you going to do with this money?
Yeah.
Like, what are the concerns they're having with TSU and giving them the money? At what?
So think about it like this. Let's say, um, you know, you're working, you've got a regular paycheck, but you went out and you bought a convertible and you used all of your savings to buy the convertible. Okay. Now, you still have your job, so you still got a regular paycheck coming in, but you got no more savings, and now you got to take care of the convertible.
Mhm.
That's what we're concerned with at the state. Not that TSU won't be able to be open, but how are you going to replenish the savings, right? So in this case, the convertible is that incoming class, that one class that was the hugest class in history. It was beautiful. It was convertible, but it takes money to keep students there, right? And then also we cleaned out our savings to get there, because in addition to having to increase student services, they also offered scholarships to all those students. And remember, the
Oh,
scholarship situation is if it costs $1, I'm only charging 50 cents. I got to come up with 50 cents from somewhere else, right? So that's a scholarship. So again, a lot of things. So the state's concern is not can TSU stay open, but we're concerned how is TSU going to rebuild its, we call them the reserves. How is TSU going to rebuild that cushion, that safety net, and um, keep moving forward and keep increasing, growing students um, and honestly, one of the concerns is how are we going to do that without increasing tuition? How are we going to do that without the price tag falling to the students? Because money doesn't just come from nowhere. And um, in higher education, as you can see, when you compare tuition at places like Belmont, Lipscomb, Belmont has beautiful buildings, but Belmont has very high tuition. And so that's kind of the trade-off. We don't want to rebuild at the expense of students, but we need to find a way to rebuild. So we're looking to alumni, we're looking to business partnerships, we're looking to a variety of industries. Um, there are a lot of folks who want to support TSU for a variety of reasons. But there are a lot of people who want to support TSU. So that's kind of the financial concern today is how do you rebuild a savings account,
mhm.
that reserve account, um, to make sure that in the future there's going to be that cushion for the university.
That's actually really good that you're saying that the state is not looking for these students to like
Yes.
carry the burden of making that money back up, like
Yeah.
raising tuition. Because like
Mhm.
my class, we were not here for that. So
Right. Right.
why we have to read, what happened.
Yes.
But
Yes.
but
Yes.
my next question would be, what steps does the state expect TSU to take to like remain full financial and like administration control?
Mhm.
Like I know
So,
President Tucker is the interim president. His it's a lot going on with administration by itself, let
mhm,
alone financial. So like
yeah,
what is the state looking for TSU to do?
yes. So, the timeline that we're kind of looking at right now is, or it's not a timeline because we don't have time checkpoints, but I guess the checklist. What we would like to see in place is a CFO, so a chief finance officer who can, from day one, just jump in and say, okay, here's how we start bringing in more money. Here's how we start saving more money. And here's how we do it with a long term plan. So, the downside with an interim, as you know, interim just means temporary or part time. So, one of the big concerns for state officials is okay, how long is this going to be temporary? When can we start making permanent decisions? When can we start, having someone who's going to be in that role and who can carry on. So that's one thing we're looking for is permanence. We call that stability. And as you pointed out, President Tucker so far has been committed to maintaining stability, but we're also looking for that long-term piece to it too. And then beyond that, the there has been talks about the Avon Williams campus. Is that something that needs to happen? I'll say this, that's not on the state's part. The state cannot force an institution to sell property. The state can't, require that property there belongs to TSU, which is the state. So the state can't make the state sell its own property, if that makes sense. So, but there is questions about the utility of Avon Williams. So as you know, it's made mostly grad classes, and most of those classes are kind of in the afternoons. What are we doing with Avon Williams during the day? Can we rent the space out? Can we charge? What are some ways that we can maximize revenues for
Mm.
the institution? So the state is looking for those kinds of plans and more than just one-off plans, but what's something that's going to, over time be sustainable to the institution as a revenue stream. Um, and that's going to look like different things depending on sort of the priorities of the institution. Research is one way that the institution could bring in more money by expanding its research enterprise, and that's kind of some of the thinking that the previous administration had. Let's expand research to bring in more dollars to support students. So the downside is none of that's quick
Yeah.
overnight money, right? So what we're looking at right now is it's going to take time and it's going to take consistency. Honestly, if you think about it, we TSU has now had 3 presidents in a year. So right now we're just looking for some consistent leadership. And honestly, one of the things that President Tucker brings to the mix is connections to other businesses, to outside communities. So in higher ed, we say that the president of the institution is the fundraiser and the friend raiser. The
Mm.
role of the president is to represent the institution and to give people confidence in donating to the institution and partnering with the institution. And so that's what President Tucker is focusing on, making sure that the image of TSU moving forward is, one that says, you can count on us. You can partner with us. We're not going anywhere. And like I said earlier, no one has questioned the academic core. So one of the things that TSU remains getting right is that academic affairs piece, that student support piece. The reason why we met, right? That investment in things like Summer Completion Academy, because those are the things that push students forward. And like we said, those are the things that the state is looking for in our data, in our metrics. So yeah, so the short answer is consistency is going to be um, what we're looking for over time.
That is actually really good. So like this is a little side question real fast. With President Tucker, why was he chose to be interim instead of already president? Is that like a personal decision he's decided to make?
It's more of a procedure. So usually, in times of change like this, um, the university will do a national search. So they'll put out the call to everyone. And so in the meantime, and that is what TSU is doing right now. So there's currently a presidential search committee, and their job is to search far and wide for the best. So what President Tucker is saying, in the meantime, I'll step in. Now, that's not to say that he won't be here in the long term either. Now that could be a personal decision. He might, and he has said before that he's around as long as we need him. So that's a personal decision. But typically, at most schools, they will put an interim in place while they're doing a national search for the best leadership. And so that's what TSU is doing, which is pretty standard.
That leads me kind of to my next question is, how does TSU compare to other public HBCUs in the state of Tennessee in terms of funding and resources?
Yeah. So again, it's complex. So for Tennessee, TSU is the only HBCU that gets direct funding from the state. So in Tennessee specifically, um, uh, TSU as our public and our land grant um, universities all in one. It gets the only state funding. But in a state like Georgia, that's very different. Okay. So Georgia, there's the land grant, which is Fort Valley State University. But then there's also Albany State and Savannah State. So in a state like Georgia, you've got one HBCU saying, oh, we need land grant funding, but the other two HBCUs are also under resourced. So that's a really good question. In Tennessee, ours is a little bit less complicated, but there are states like Georgia, Alabama is another example, North Carolina is another example, where when you have multiple public HBCUs, the conversation about funding your HBCUs becomes a lot more complex. And it could be a difference between, so in Georgia, how rural that state is. So Fort Valley in Valdosta versus Savannah State in Savannah. Valdosta is a little bit more rural than Savannah is. So the funding can be different based on the students who go there, right? Enrollment. So comparing HBCUs between other HBCUs even becomes complex because HBCUs themselves are not a monolith. Um, so different programs, different focus areas, different areas of study. So an HBCU that has an engineering department like Tuskegee, for example, will have more funding because of that STEM versus one. Let me think of a good example. Like Lane College here in Tennessee that doesn't have an engineering program or engineering department, so they're not getting those company investments. So within Tennessee, we don't really have a good comparison, but TSU compared to other state universities. Let's talk about that. So TSU compared to MTSU, UT Martin, Austin P. I'm forgetting the other state schools. We got University of Memphis, East Tennessee State, and UT Knoxville and UT Chat. I think that's everybody. Anywho, comparatively speaking, TSU actually is about middle of the pack. So in terms of if you look at like percent of overall revenues that come from the state, TSU is right in the middle. But that is misleading. Okay, so revenues, that's everything that comes in. So for example, UT Knoxville, they have a lot of revenues, but they also have athletics, right?
Yeah.
They also have um, they've got research stations and they partner with OR&L, the national lab out there. So even looking at revenue is complex because different schools have different access. Now, we acknowledge that even that access is based out of a history of segregation and racism. But the point is, even today, um, there are no apples to apples comparisons between institutions. So, yes. So, in terms of like revenues from the state, TSU is about in the middle. Um, it's like I said, since 2007, the state has been matching that land grant funding piece. And then all of the other money that comes to TSU is based on student progression and research and those other categories. So not to get ahead of you, but how can students help? Honestly, passing your classes. So when students have to stop out because of SAP or when students have to retake a class, that shows up in state data. And so while you may think, I'll just take it next semester,
Right.
that's a semester that TSU is not getting credit for your progression.
Mm.
So your progress literally matters to TSU. When we talk about students are the lifeblood of the institution, literally. That's why so many people are talking about peer tutoring and faculty tutoring, and there's so many centers and they're open and after hours and before hours. It's because literally when you don't pass classes, it makes a difference to the funding that the institution gets. And so at a school like TSU, where we prioritize access, right? So we accept um, anyone who wants to come to college. At a school like UT Knoxville, where the acceptance rate is a lot lower, they have a little bit more flexibility. So UT Knoxville, they only accept the best students. And so they don't have to worry as much about pass the class. But at TSU, where they take students, from all spectrums who want an education, that's why they're so invested in student success because literally from year to year, it makes a difference on how many classes are passed.
Yeah, and that's also one of my things is like I feel like TSU has so much potential when it comes to HBCUs. Like we're one of the only I correct me if I'm wrong, but HBCUs in a big city.
Yeah.
Like we're literally in the heart of Nashville. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
know why we're not maximizing that part of it as well. It's like it's it's always stuff to do because we're in the city.
Yes.
Other HBCUs are usually not put right in the middle of a city.
Very true. Like
But
Prairie View. I went to Prairie View A&M, cows all around. That's it. That's all that's around the school. You got to drive like an hour from Houston to get to Prairie View A&M. I mean, sheesh, that's the middle of nowhere. TSU, you're right there in the city.
everything. You did get a little ahead of me of how students can help. I know when we had a talk, when we in our meeting that you mentioned something that stood out to me is when the students are thriving, the university is thriving. So,
Yes.
and I know you already touched on like the progression and the retention. That's
Mhm.
how students can help. So,
Yes.
I just wanted to make sure that was a little really clear. It's like passing those classes,
Mhm.
moving forward within the university, which helps the funding. So our president just added back Tucker. He just put
Mhm.
out we'll have Friday classes
Yes. Yeah.
starting next semester.
Mhm. Mhm.
From your opinion, how do you think that can help the university?
Yes, that's a really good question. So, um, full disclosure, I'm a teacher at heart. So I think more class is better, just kind of off top. Sorry, just got to put that out there. But here's the concern that Dr. Melton and her team had. Um, One of the secret sauces, right, of an HBCU is that student life and belonging. And so when TSU stopped having classes on Fridays and students started going home and the campus was kind of quiet and dead. Um, Honestly, they saw a decrease in engagement. We keep track of that with various surveys throughout the year. So there's been a decrease in student engagement. And it also corresponded to an overall dip in accessing those resources that we talked about, like tutoring and so on and so forth. So um, this decision was made from a policy perspective for a variety of reasons. One of those is to maybe help get students back engaged. Like it all comes back to students. Um, Dr. Mountain's team was concerned that if there were no classes on Friday, you might leave on Wednesday and might not come back till Monday morning. So
Right.
you're really only taking classes 3 days a week and you all four. That's not enough school, not enough to stick. And so it's the goal now of the administration that not just to have more class, but that student engagement piece. The other thing is that in terms of the decision itself was made for research purposes. So at the time, Friday was supposed to be a day for faculty research, so that faculty could, devote their entire attention to writing papers and doing things like that. But now with an overall, realization that research isn't going to save us, that's also part of the return to student focus. So you might not like the way it sounds, but it really was a decision made for students, but specifically for student success. And by giving students more of an opportunity to be engaged. And you'll remember one of the questions that I asked is, what's your extracurricular? What's your co-curricular activity? Because we also know that having something to tie you to the institution keeps you coming back. And so if you're dipping out as soon as you can, you're not having extracurricular activities. So in order to increase the number of students who are doing things on campus, being engaged, and to increase engagement in those student support services overall. Some of the reasons that went into that decision for the Friday class. But I will also say that was an institution decision, not necessarily one that the state had any influence on. I just know about it because I happen to talk to the people making the decisions.
Yeah. I know a lot of students were like, "Oh my God, why are we having Friday classes?" I had another question about this as well. It
Yeah.
kind of asked the same question with the funding. So, will we be spending more money by having those Friday classes?
And in fact, we were losing money by letting y'all leave because you know what? It costs the same amount of money to keep that building open for faculty as it does to keep it open for students. And it's not like we shut the dorms down when y'all left either. So the money was being spent whether y'all were here or not. So it doesn't, I guess we could say it's a net zero difference in terms of the amount that the university was spending, um, you know, that extra day keeping the classes. Yeah,
I
yeah.
kind of felt that too because, like we said, all the extra help buildings like the ARC, they're
Hmm.
still open
Yeah.
on Fridays.
Yes.
So I was
Yes.
like, they're already paying these people to still come into work
Yes.
while
Yes.
we have the day off.
Right. Right.
So, so has it any been like statistics proven by having the Friday classes? Like,
No, but you know what? Let me get my little um I'm very interested to do some research on this and I will get back to you
I just,
on the difference. Yeah. Yeah. Um so at the elementary level, um not or before K-12, I should say, there has been research on what we call a 45-15 schedule. So that's 45 days on, which is 9 weeks, and then 15 days off. So you go throughout the whole school year, or go throughout the calendar year, 45 days, and then you get a 3 week break, and then 45 days and get a 3 week break instead of a long summer break and a long winter break. And there is data that shows there's slightly better learning when you move to that schedule. I don't know if similar studies have been done at the higher ed. So I will take a look and get back to you because I don't know. I don't know.
all right, coming to our last question that we kind of have today is what advice do you have for student leaders like me who want
Mhm.
to use the leadership roles to kind of educate and advocate for TSU success?
Yes. Well, so this number one, reaching out to people and asking questions is very important. I was so excited. I told my boss, who is the executive director, that I was doing this interview today, and he was like, "That's so encouraging that students are asking questions." As I started off, you've got to be wary of your source, and that I even questioned the Tennessean, because remember there are a lot of people with different agendas, and then there are some people who are trying to save face in all of this too, because at the end of the day, a lot of decisions were made by a lot of different people, and now a lot of people are pointing fingers. And so um, there are, like I said, at least five narratives out there. So number one is to ask questions, and to keep asking questions of both people at the school, but when you run into people like me, ask questions too. The other, study, 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 study. And we can't stress enough, in Tennessee, higher education, these Republicans only care about outcomes. They care about the number of students who come back and the number of students who graduate. And so while people like me are fighting to understand some of the complex issues about past funding, what students can do right now today that's going to make a difference next semester is making sure that you're getting the help that's offered to pass your classes. Because every year, General Assembly meets to pass a budget that gives money to all of our public institutions. And that money is based not on how did TSU do compared to UT, but that money is based on how did TSU do compared to TSU last year. Okay. So when TSU goes before the Senate, like they did yesterday, to present their budget, they're doing so based on their improvement over last year's numbers. So for every improvement students can make over last, even if it's taking one more class than you took last year, right? So every class matters too. Um, if you can fit 15 credit hours instead of 12 into your schedule, that's one way to do it, because the state checks for 30, 60, 90. We're looking for multiples of 15, not multiples of 12. So if you're only taking 12 credit hours a semester, that means you won't show up until the middle of your sophomore year, right? To get to that 30 credit hours. So those are some of, we call that baked in the cake. That's just the way higher ed works in Tennessee. So that's one small thing that you can do, is to get help. And then the third is just to remain informed. So a lot of the conversations that are happening right now happen publicly. So I would encourage you to pay attention to the State Building Commission, that meets semi-regularly, but TSU has been on the agenda for the State Building Commission as they've been working through these financial changes. And then also paying attention to the legislature, in particular, the education committees. Um, right now, things are kind of stable. Things are kind of, like I said, we're at a wait and see period, but there is that bill that's going to direct THEC to re-examine the numbers. That's likely going to be passed. And so when that happens, then we'll start to try to put some concrete data to this, sort of what's fair, what's owed, where do we draw the line. So yeah, just remaining informed is another thing that students can do, because truly, and I say this, I've worked for the state now for 7 years, but you have to believe that the state is on the side of the students. Okay. So believe what you want to about the institution, the people running the institution. At the end of the day, every single legislature, every single state employee wants the students who enroll to succeed, because that's taxpayer dollars that are going towards the upkeep and the running of the institution. And so when TSU succeeds, everyone succeeds. And at the end of the day, the issues that TSU are facing right now, you know, they're independent of being an HBCU. So the issues that TSU are having, they didn't happen because TSU is an HBCU. They happened because of poor planning. They happened because of that, the influx that year, and who knew that that was going to drain our sources. And it happened because, the change in the funding structure, and we put all our eggs in a research basket, and that didn't happen. That didn't pan out the way we wanted to. There are a couple of different places we can point the finger. it's not helpful at this point to do that. What's helpful moving forward is to be part of the solution. So, yeah, students maintaining those 4.0 GPAs or 3.0, we'll take it. 2.5, we'll take it. Passing GPAs. Um, and staying informed and connected to the process as directly as possible. Make sure you're not just getting your news from the shade room. I got my friends who are sending me those posts. They're not always right either. Don't get your news from the comments. The people in the comments are also wrong. Get your information directly from the sources because TSU is a public institution, everything that involves TSU is always going to be public. There's always going to be a public meeting that happens whenever decisions are made. So staying plugged into the sources is going to be your best way to get it directly from the source.
Thank you so much for
Yeah,
come out of your day today and allowing me to interview you about these questions. It
happy
really
to do.
means a whole lot to me.
I'm happy to do it anytime.